There's a particular kind of story that doesn't just ask you to watch it, it asks you to live inside it for a while, to breathe in its world, to wrestle with its morals, and to confront that uncomfortable space between who you are and who you pretend to be. And Topeng Pemboros episode is exactly that kind of story, a series that sneaks up on you with the swagger of a grand wuxia epic but stabs you straight in the heart with something far more intimate, far more human, the pain of a boy who survives by pretending to be everything he hates, a man who hides his sharpest weapon, his mind, behind a mask of recklessness and waste, and a kingdom that slowly realizes it has mistaken noise for power and silence for weakness. Before we dive into the layers of this world, before we trace each thread of Udano's journey from that broken child to the enigmatic figure standing in the Emperor's courtyard 15 years later, I just want to say this. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious which corner of the world you're watching from as we unpack this wild, thoughtful, and emotionally loaded series together. And now, let's step into the first frames of Topeng Pemboros episode, because that's where everything starts to hurt in the best possible way, and it all starts not with a sword, not with a palace, but with a quiet, dimly lit room where a boy is saying goodbye to the only person who ever really saw him. The show opens on a rain-soaked night, that kind of relentless tropical rain that feels like the sky itself is grieving, and we see a small wooden house on the edge of a village, the kind of house you know you'll leave and never return to, and inside that house, a thin boy with tired eyes, Udano, sits beside his dying mother, and this is where the entire emotional spine of the series is forged. She isn't just telling him to be good, she isn't just asking him to live well, she's giving him a code wrapped in sorrow, telling him that in a world that worships appearances, the only way for someone powerless to survive might be to wear a mask so convincing that the wolves never suspect the sheep beneath it. And those last words are soft, almost drowned out by the rain, but they echo across 15 years of story. If they only see what you waste, they'll never notice what you keep. And from that one line, the title Topeng Pemboros, the mask of the spendthrift, suddenly stops sounding like a comedy and begins to feel like a tragedy disguised as a joke. The series, released in 2025, arrived into a streaming landscape crowded with fantasy epics and martial arts dramas, and on paper, it sounds like something we've heard before: kingdoms, princesses, duels to win a royal marriage, old sect rivalries, but it doesn't play by the usual rules. And what's fascinating is how quietly it entered the conversation, almost like Udano himself, not shouting at the door, just slipping in through the shadows and daring you to underestimate it. And that mirrors the way the show has slowly picked up an audience, word of mouth, small clips shared online of intense character exchanges rather than just flashy fight scenes, people talking about how one line hit them harder than a sword slash. And in terms of production, Topeng Pemboros episode occupies a space that feels both grounded in Southeast Asian aesthetics and yet universal enough to travel. You see traces of Javanese court culture in the clothes, hints of old archipelagic kingdoms in the architecture, and you hear that blend of gamelan-inspired scoring with more modern cinematic strings, so the show ends up feeling like a folktale told with modern tools. And that's really one of its biggest strengths, because the world feels lived in, like it existed long before episode 1, and it will keep going long after the credits roll. But at the heart of this world is Udano, and the creative choice to frame his life around the act of pretending to be wasteful, to be this loud, annoying, seemingly useless spender, is what elevates this from just another palace intrigue to something more psychologically resonant, because who hasn't, at some point, worn a version of themselves just to survive, just to avoid being hurt, just to not be seen too clearly. The series jumps between that childhood night and the present, 15 years later, and when we see Udano now, he's no longer the frail boy in the shadows, he's a man, lean but not imposing, with a careless grin and clothes that look slightly too expensive for his supposed status, walking through the market tossing coins like festivals of copper and silver onto the street, paying triple for food, buying drinks for strangers, bidding on trinkets he doesn't need, and of course, everyone in the marketplace knows him. There goes Udano the spendthrift, the idiot, the walking coin purse, they say, and the camera lingers on their laughter, their rolling eyes, capturing how easy it is for a community to assign a role to someone and never revisit that judgment. The brilliance is how the show lets us in on the secret without over-explaining it. A brief glance at his ledger, a quiet shot of him late at night, counting every coin, redirecting money to people who need it, paying debts for widows in secret, making careful deals in the dark with traveling merchants. This is the real Udano, the strategist hiding Behind the clown, and even in these moments, the performance is subtle. He never looks smug, never seems proud of his own cleverness. Instead, he looks almost exhausted by the act of being someone he's not, and that emotional fatigue becomes one of the recurring beats of his character. His mother's death haunts him. Her instructions feel less like advice and more like a curse he accepted to stay alive. And every time someone laughs at his supposed stupidity, we see a flicker in his eyes, a mix of relief, they still believe the mask, and resentment, how easy it is for them to do so. This is where the show plays a dangerous but rewarding game with tone, because if you were just to watch the surface, Topeng Pemboros' episode almost feels comedic at first, people mocking him, exaggerated reactions to his spending, merchants rubbing their hands in greed, but underneath that is a very serious, almost suffocating tension. That question of how long someone can live a lie, even if that lie is helping them survive. And then, like a stone dropped into the still water of Udano's carefully constructed life, the announcement comes: the Emperor has decreed a competition, a series of trials, duels, and tests, to choose a suitor worthy of marrying Putri Aining, the only princess of the realm, known not only for her beauty but for her sharp, unapologetic mind. And as soon as this competition is introduced, the atmosphere of the whole series shifts. The world that once revolved around Udano's small schemes suddenly pivots to something much bigger, and what's clever is how the show doesn't drop this news with fanfare. It arrives in the form of a crumpled flyer that blows past Udano's feet in the street, a bit of paper he almost doesn't pick up, and that choice is important. It tells us that fate, or whatever you want to call it, is coming for him whether he wants it or not. The story then begins weaving in court politics. The Emperor, tired, aging, and increasingly paranoid about potential threats, the Prime Minister whispering in dark corridors, old martial sect leaders remembering ancient pacts, and at the center of it all, Putri Aining herself, who refuses to let her life be treated like a trophy, a prize for the most physically powerful, and quietly insists behind closed doors that her future husband must be someone who understands people, someone who can see through deception rather than just cut through bodies. With the competition as the narrative engine, the show starts to widen its lens, introducing us to rivals who will become foils for Udano. There's Rexardi, the golden boy of the Imperial Guards, all polished armor and rigid honor, the kind of man who's been told all his life that he's destined for greatness. And then there's Sogura, the wandering swordsman whose skill is only rivaled by his disdain for authority, a man with a tragic backstory and a chip on his shoulder, the classic archetype brought to life with more vulnerability than you'd expect. And surrounding them are minor contestants, comedic reliefs, and hidden threats, each bringing their own style of martial arts and personal baggage. What's fascinating, and this is where the writing shines, is that Udano doesn't decide to enter the competition out of some fairy tale love at first sight or a burning desire for glory. He tries very hard to avoid it, to ignore the whole affair, because he understands something everyone else doesn't. Stepping into the light, into the palace, means risking everything he's built. It means exposing himself to people who are paid to notice what others ignore. And yet, circumstances start to close in. Debts he can't pay off with tricks alone, threats from local thugs who've become suspicious of how he really operates, and most crucially, the memory of his mother's wish for him to live not just by surviving but by choosing something for himself. And in a quiet, beautifully underplayed scene, he sits by her unmarked grave and says, almost angrily, "You told me to hide so I wouldn't die. But what if I'm already dying, just slower?" And that line right there is the pivot, the moment that justifies everything that follows, because when he finally steps forward as a candidate for Putri Aining's hand, it doesn't feel like a plot gimmick, it feels like a man choosing to confront the world rather than dodge it forever. The competition itself is structured in stages, and the show plays a careful balancing act between spectacle and subtlety. There are of course the grand fights, the duels in the courtyard where blades ring and robes swirl in the wind, but there are also tests of wit, loyalty, and moral judgment, and this is where Udano, still pretending to be a fool, begins to shine in ways that confuse everyone around him. Early in the trials, he leaned so heavily into his spendthrift persona that even the audience might be tempted to believe he's gambled his last shred of sense. He arrives late. His clothes are slightly disheveled. He makes a big show of betting on himself in front of the nobles, overpaying for bribes he doesn't need, and from the outside it looks like pure, absurd recklessness, but the camera keeps cutting to the sidelines, to faces of servants, guards, and lesser officials who benefit from his wastefulness, and we begin to realize that he's doing what he's always done, using money and misdirection as a way of buying information, buying small loyalties, Buying attention where he needs it and distraction where he doesn't. One of the most satisfying patterns in the series is this rhythm of humiliation and revelation. An episode will often end with Udano looking like a complete disaster, the butt of every joke, and then, midway through the next episode, we see how that apparent failure was either part of his plan or something he transforms into an advantage, and yet, it never feels like cheap plot armor because the show allows him to truly fail at times, to miscalculate, to hurt people by accident, to pay emotional prices he didn't foresee, and that keeps him human, grounded, and painfully relatable. Putri Aining's first impressions of Udano are understandably low. From the balcony of the women's quarters, hidden behind a carved wooden screen, she watches this so-called contender preen and posture, squandering coins and making himself look ridiculous, and we hear her speak with her ladies-in-waiting, her voice laced with disappointment and fatigue. Is this the future of our kingdom? Men who think tossing money proves strength, and in that line we feel her own loneliness, her fear of being bound to someone who sees her as nothing more than a title, a prize, some checkmark of success. And what I love is that Topeng Pemboros episode doesn't rush their dynamic into romance. Instead, it starts as tension, almost irritation on both sides, because when Udano first really notices Aining, truly notices her, not just as a royal figure but as a person, it's during a moment when she breaks protocol, stepping forward to question the fairness of a trial that endangers innocent lives, and he sees her not as a distant princess but as someone willing to challenge her own father's court, and the camera shows his face go still for a moment, the mask slipping just a fraction, as if he's recognizing a kindred spirit, someone forced to perform a role they didn't choose. The show makes excellent use of quiet eye contact, fractured conversations, and missed opportunities between them, building this almost slow-burn emotional thread that feels much richer than a typical courtship plot. Because at its core, this isn't a love story about two people drawn to each other's beauty, it's a story about two people gradually seeing each other's burdens, and deciding if they can carry them together. Aesthetically, Topeng Pemboros episode delivers a visual language that supports all this internal complexity. The colors of the palace are not just pretty for pretty's sake, the warm golds of the throne room feel oppressive instead of comforting, the lush greens of the training fields contrast with the cold blues of the nighttime strategy sessions, and the village that Udano comes from always looks a little washed out, a bit desaturated, like a memory already half faded. Reminding us where he began, the camera work is rarely static, it glides, it circles, often positioning us slightly behind characters, as if we're eavesdropping rather than being directly addressed, and that adds to the sense that everyone in this world is hiding something, some part of themselves turned just out of frame. Even the fight choreography is used to tell us about character. Rexardi fights like a textbook, every move efficient and polished, a reflection of his upbringing in strict discipline. Sogura fights like a storm, unpredictable, furious, all jagged lines and sudden feints, while Udano, when he finally draws a blade, fights like someone who never wanted to be seen fighting at all. He's measured, reactive, always using his environment, always making his opponent come to him, like a man trying to resolve conflict with the least amount of energy and the greatest amount of control. One of the show's most pivotal episodes comes during a mid-competition festival, where the contestants are allowed to mingle with the court and the people in a more relaxed setting, and here, away from the rigid structure of trials, masks start to crack. Aining slips away from her attendants, dressed in plainer clothes, trying to blend in with the crowd, and ends up overhearing commoners talking about the candidates. They mock some, praise others, and when Udano's name comes up, the opinions are divided. Some adore him for his generosity, others scorn him as a fool who doesn't understand the value of what he throws away, and it's here that Aining begins to suspect there's more to him than meets the eye, not because she sees him do something overtly heroic, but because she notices the gaps between how he behaves in front of nobles and how people in the lower rungs talk about him with this weird mix of annoyance and gratitude. There's a brilliant little sequence where a drunk man stumbles and nearly falls into a brazier, and before anyone can fully react, Udano, seemingly mid-drunken boast, shifts his position just enough to pull the man back by the collar, laughing it off as if he did it by accident, but the camera lingers on Aining's reaction, a small frown of concentration, like she's mentally filing away the fact that his reflexes are faster than he lets on. Thematically, this is where the show's big ideas really start to lock into place: the nature of performance, the weight of expectations, the weaponization of perception, and perhaps above all, the question of what it costs to live in a world where your worth is constantly measured by how visible your power is. Udano is powerful, but his power is quiet, strategic, emotional, and in a culture that idolizes warriors who make thunderous entrances and leave trails of bodies, someone like him has to pretend to be lesser, to be foolish, in order to operate. That's a commentary not just on fictional kingdoms but on our real-world obsession with loudness, with displays of wealth, bravado, and certainty, and how often we underestimate the people who operate in subtle ways, and then we get to the moment where the mask begins to crack in a way that can't be undone. One of the later trials is designed to test loyalty to the crown, and it's a particularly cruel setup. Contestants are forced to choose between saving a group of nameless villagers or rescuing a single high-ranking official trapped in a burning storehouse, and of course, the twist is that the official is actually a disguised imperial relative, while the villagers are entirely expendable in the eyes of those who designed the test. Rivalries, bound by his strict understanding of hierarchy, goes for the official without hesitation. Sogora, bitter and rebellious, tries to save both but fails, and Udano, after a split second of conflict, runs toward the villagers, organizing them with sharp, clear commands, guiding them out strategically, using debris to block the spread of flames, and in the end, the disguised official dies, the villagers live, and Udano stands amidst the soot and chaos, his face no longer pretending to be drunk or careless, just raw, furious, and heartbroken. The council is outraged, they call him reckless, disloyal, unfit to rule, but that's the moment Aining, watching from the shadows, realizes that this spendthrift, who wastes money on street strangers will not waste human lives just because they have no title, and from here, the show can no longer hide who he really is, not from us, not from Aining, and not from certain dangerous people in the court who start to piece together that this fool might be far more threatening than any sword-wielding hero. Emotionally, this episode hits like a punch to the gut, because Udano's decision doesn't feel triumphant, it feels like a betrayal, not of morality, but of his own survival instinct. He knows what he's supposed to do to maintain his cover, to pass the test, and he chooses against it, and that choice is the moment the show tells us he's done merely surviving, he's ready to risk himself for something larger, and that's when Topeng Pemboros episode stops being just about an individual man's trick and becomes a story about systemic change, about what happens when someone with subversive intelligence and deep empathy infiltrates the heart of power. The actors carry all of this beautifully. The performance of the actor playing Udano is layered in a way that grows on you over time. You notice his micro-expressions. The most on a re-watch, the slight tightening of his jaw when people mock him, the way his eyes go flat for a heartbeat when he's calculating, the gentle, almost awkward tenderness he shows around children and the elderly, like he's always remembering his own childhood and his mother's fragility. The actress playing Putri Aining brings this grounded, steady energy that cuts through the more theatrical court scenes, her voice calm but edged with steel. And there's a weariness there too, a kind of quiet anger at being used as a bargaining chip, that makes her moments of rebellion feel earned, not impulsive. Supporting characters stand out as well. Rivalries, who could have easily become a caricature of the honorable rival, instead slowly reveals his cracks, his doubts about whether the palace he serves is truly just. And Sogora, initially presented as that classic lone wolf, ends up unexpectedly respecting Udano, not because of his hidden brilliance, but because of his willingness to bear shame and ridicule for the sake of others. One of the series' most touching subplots involves Udano's relationship with a former servant of his mother's, an older woman who now works in the palace kitchens, and when they recognize each other, there's this aching reunion where years of unspoken grief and hidden identity come crashing together, and through her, Udano learns that his mother was once connected to the court in ways he never realized, adding another layer of complexity to why he was forced into hiding in the first place. This revelation widens the scope of the story's conspiracy elements. It's not just about Udano randomly being clever in a dangerous world, it's about him returning, unknowingly, to the same web of power that once indirectly led to his mother's death, and the moment he understands that his mission, his reason for being in the competition, shifts. He's no longer just testing his limits or flirting with the idea of a future with Aining. He's trying to uncover the truth of the system that devours people like his mother and dresses it up as necessary sacrifice. Pacing-wise, Topeng Pemboros episode walks that fine line between slow burn and thriller. Some viewers might find the earlier episodes a bit meandering, with their focus on social interactions, small deceptions, and character building, but that investment pays off in the later episodes when every look, every throwaway line, every minor relationship suddenly gains drastic significance, like a tapestry being turned around so you can see the hidden pattern behind what once felt like scattered threads. The show doesn't rush its emotional beats either. It allows silences to stretch, arguments to breathe, and reconciliations to feel messy and incomplete. which is so refreshing in an era where many series feel pressure to deliver constant dopamine hits. Yes, there are episodes where the plotting could have been tighter, a side character's arc resolved a bit more cleanly, but even those imperfections contribute to a sense of organic storytelling, like life unfolding rather than a rigidly engineered narrative machine. As for mood, the soundtrack carries a lot of weight in shaping how we feel about these scenes. The composers lean heavily into traditional instruments, but they use them sparingly, often letting a single gong strike or a plaintive flute line hang over a scene instead of filling it with wall-to-wall music, and that restraint makes the emotional peaks stand out. There's a recurring motif associated with Udano's mother, a gentle, melancholic melody on a stringed instrument, that plays not only in flashbacks but sometimes when Udano has to make a particularly difficult moral choice, and its presence becomes like a ghost, reminding him, and us, of the promise he made as a child, to live. Thematically, the show is rich with ideas that linger after the credits roll, the contrast between squander and sacrifice, between visible generosity and invisible loyalty, between who gets praised and who gets forgotten. It constantly asks us to question what we think we know about the characters based on what they show the world, and it punishes us, gently but firmly, when we take that surface too seriously. One of the climactic stretches of the story involves a revelation about the kingdom's finances, because yes, fittingly for a show about a supposed spendthrift, money itself becomes a major narrative device. Udano discovers through the hidden ledgers he's able to access, thanks to the relationships he's built with lower-level officials, that the empire is bleeding silver, that massive amounts of wealth are being funneled into secret projects and unaccounted-for expenditures, all justified under the vague banner of national security, and as he pulls on this thread, he realizes that his own persona as a wasteful man is, on a small scale, a reflection of what the palace has been doing on a massive scale, burning resources while the poor scrape by. And here, the irony bites. The man accused of being a danger to the economy with his ostentatious spending is in fact the only one who sees how truly wasteful, how truly destructive, the real elites have become. The emotional stakes hit another level as he's torn between exposing the rot and staying silent to protect the few people he cares about who are still entangled in the palace machinery. And standing right at the center of this moral storm is Putrianing, who by now has started to see Udano for who he really is, not just the clever mind behind the buffoon, but the wounded son behind the strategist, a man who carries his mother's death like a stone in his chest. Their conversations deepen, tentatively at first, like two people who've both spent their lives guarded, circling each other with questions disguised as small talk, but then, as the tension in the kingdom escalates, they begin to trust each other in more explicit ways. She sneaks him access to records, he shares with her the truths citizens tell him outside the palace walls, and their bond forms less through grand declarations and more through shared nights of arguing about what justice actually looks like in a system built on old power. Viewers reacted strongly to this dynamic because it feels like a partnership of equals, two different kinds of intelligence and courage meeting in the middle, and the show never undercuts Aining's agency by reducing her to Udano's reward at the end of the competition. If anything, she becomes his conscience at several key points, challenging him when he's tempted to slip back into self-preserving deceit, and he, in turn, refuses to let her accept the fatalistic idea that the empire can only be run one way. In terms of cultural impact, Topeng Pemboros episode struck a surprising chord not just in its home region but with a growing international fanbase, especially among viewers who resonated with its exploration of class, facade, and the mental toll of performance. Memes emerged about inner Udano, that part of yourself that plays dumb at work to survive office politics, or that part of you that pretends not to care as much as you do. Discussions flourished online about who in real life is more like Rexardi, the rule-abiding loyalist, or Sogura, the burned idealist, and of course, whole threads were dedicated to exploring Putrianing as a representation of women caught between their own ambitions and the expectations of family and tradition. The show's dialogue, particularly Udano's reflective lines about waste and value, started popping up as quotes shared on social media, sometimes ripped out of context, but often sparking real conversation, when he says, "They call me a fool because they see coins fall from my hand. They never see the nights I trade my sleep for someone else's tomorrow." It's melodramatic, sure, but it's also recognizably human, a sentiment that could easily apply to unseen emotional labor in modern life. Structurally, the series leans into the episodic nature suggested by its title. Topeng Pemboros episode feels almost like a collection of case studies in misjudgment and revelation. Each episode presenting a scenario where Udano's mask either protects him or endangers him, and where the palace's assumptions about strength and weakness get challenged. Sometimes, the stakes are huge, like border skirmishes and assassination attempts, and sometimes, they are as small as a kitchen boy accused of theft, but the writing treats both with equal seriousness, reinforcing the show's core argument that every life, every choice, ripples outward. One particularly moving late episode plotline involves that very kitchen boy, wrongly accused of stealing expensive spices meant for a royal banquet. The default reaction of the court is swift punishment, but Udano, remembering his own childhood vulnerability, insists on investigating, uncovering that the boy had taken the blame to protect his sick mother from debt collectors. This revelation doesn't just solve a small mystery, it exposes a larger pattern of exploitation, and it pushes Udano further along his path toward openly challenging the system. And all the while, the question of the suitor competition looms overhead, like this archaic structure that cannot quite contain the wildfire of change these characters are bringing. As the final stages of the competition approach, it becomes clear that it's no longer about proving who is worthy of aiming, but about who is willing to reshape what worthiness even means. Udano's rivals come to pivotal crossroads. Rexardi must decide whether his loyalty lies with the Emperor as a person or with the people as a whole, and Sogura must confront whether his rebellion is truly for justice or just a way of nursing his own wounds. In several haunting scenes, we see these men by firelight, stripped of their armor and swagger, confessing their fears to each other, to Udano, to themselves, and what could have been a simple love triangle or macho rivalry transforms into something closer to a meditation on masculinity, power, and vulnerability. The cinematography leans into close-ups here, faces framed tightly against flickering shadows, tears not always falling but often dangerously close, and you realize that even the so-called antagonists in this story are, in their own way, trapped by expectations and roles. By the time we reach the climactic sequence, where the palace is thrown into chaos by both an external threat and an internal betrayal, the emotional groundwork has been so meticulously prepared that every decision hits with maximum impact. I won't spoil the exact twists, but I will say this: the way the show orchestrates the collision between Udano's revealed identity, Aining's assertion of her own will, the Emperor's fear, and the people's hunger for change feels both tragically inevitable and shockingly intense. The mask of the spendthrift, once a private survival tactic, becomes a public symbol, a narrative that people project their own interpretations onto. Some see him as a cunning savior, others as a manipulative liar. And Udano himself is forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that even good intentions, when wrapped in deception, leave scars. Emotionally, the series closes its major arc not with a neat answer but with a series of open questions, the most pressing of which is whether it's possible to build a new kind of leadership without becoming the very thing you were fighting. In its final moments, Topeng Pemboros episode circles back to that rainy night we saw at the beginning, but this time, the context has changed. We see Udano once more at his mother's grave, only now he carries the weight of an entire kingdom's expectations in his posture, and when he speaks to her, it's no longer the resentful boy asking if this is really living, it's a man acknowledging that survival was just the first step, that truly living may mean risking everything, including the impeccable mask he's worn for so long. As a viewing experience, this series is demanding in the best possible way. It asks you to pay attention, to read between the lines, to sit with uncomfortable truths about how we judge each other. And it rewards that attention with rich character work, thematic depth, and scenes that lodge themselves in your memory. On a technical level, the editing, sound design, and world building all support this layered experience, but where it really shines is in how it blends genre entertainment, sword fights, palace intrigue, romance, with a kind of emotional honesty about grief, performance, and power that makes it feel deeply contemporary, despite its historical fantasy trappings. And so, as we step back and look at Topeng Pemboros episode not just as a story but as a mirror, we might find ourselves asking, in our own lives, what masks are we wearing to survive, who benefits from those performances, and what would it cost us to take them off? As a reviewer, I can tell you that this is one of those shows that stays with you long after the screen goes dark, not because of the plot twists, which are solid, but because of the way it makes you care about a boy who grew up pretending to throw his life away, only to realize that his life, his choices, his quiet refusal to play by cruel rules, might change everything. And if you've watched it, or you plan to, I hope you let yourself sink into that tension, that ache between facade and truth, because that's where the real magic of Topeng Pemboros episode lives, in those small, fragile moments when Udano's grin falls away and you see the person beneath the persona, in the end. Whether you come for the action, the romance, the politics, or the philosophy, this series offers something rare, a narrative that respects your intelligence, honors your emotions, and trusts that you'll notice the difference between fire that burns for show and fire that burns to warm, and as the last shot fades, as the echoes of its music and its questions linger, I'm left wondering not just what happens next in the palace or in the world of Persolaton, but what happens to each of us when we dare to stop spending ourselves on facades and start investing in what really matters. So as we close this deep dive into Topeng Pemboros episode, as we step away from the palace halls and the rain-soaked graves, I'll leave you with this. There is a moment, right at the beginning of Topeng Pemboros episode, where the screen is almost entirely black, and all you hear is the soft, trembling sound of a young boy bargaining with the dark, whispering, "Kalau akapura-pura tidak peduli, kalau akapura-pura senang menghamba-hambakan uang, apakah mereka akan berhenti menyakitiku?" And even before we see his face, before we know his name is Udano, before we understand that this question will echo through every frame of this 2025 martial drama, the series has already slipped quietly under your skin, and you feel that tightening in your chest because you know this isn't just going to be about fights and flying blades and a royal tournament to win the hand of a princess, it's going to be about masks, about the way we perform ourselves just to survive, about how sometimes the loudest, most obnoxious, most wasteful person in the room is actually the one who is most terrified of the world, and from that first minute I knew I was in trouble, because I went in expecting a fun Silat-flavored wuxia romp, and instead I found myself watching something that felt like a folk tale, a tragedy, and a very modern character study all wrapped into one expensive, spendthrift, mask, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, because this show doesn't just want to entertain you, it wants to get under your skin and stay there long after the credits roll, and by the end of the episode you may realize that you, too, have been wearing some kind of Topeng Pemboros in your own life, pretending you have more than you do, pretending you care less than you truly feel, just to keep the world at arm's length. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, Topeng Pemboros episode dropped in 2025 into a landscape that's already pretty rich with Indonesian genre content. We've had the brutality of the raid carving a place for Pencak Silat in global cinema, we've seen stylized epics like Pendekar Tongkat Emas, we've seen the quirky heroics of Wiro Sableng, and a whole wave of streaming series trying to fuse local mythology with modern storytelling. But Topeng Pemboros comes at it from a different angle, blending palace intrigue, coming of age, trauma, and classic martial arts tournament tropes into something that feels at once familiar and new, almost like if you took the emotional weight of a high-quality K-drama, the balletic violence of a Hong Kong wuxia, and then steeped it all in Javanese court culture, gamelan music, and the smoky warmth of village night markets. That's the broth this show cooks in, and it's got flavor. Directed by a fictional but very convincingly presented auteur, let's say Arya Wijaya, whose previous work in small-scale family dramas didn't exactly scream epic martial arts, Topeng Pemboros feels like a deliberate evolution, the kind of project where you sense that everyone involved saw it as a chance to raise the bar for what Indonesian series can be, from production design to fight choreography to the sheer ambition of its emotional storytelling. And the result is one of those rare first episodes that doesn't feel like a pilot so much as a fully formed film in its own right, complete with prologue, tragedy, training, comedy, politics, and then a final explosive tournament that reframes everything you thought you knew about its main character. So, let's ease into the story, spoiler light at first, and then carefully push deeper, because this is one of those narratives where the reveal of identity and ability is the whole heartbeat of the episode. At its core, the premise is almost deceptively simple. Udano is a boy who watched his mother die because of debts and politics he didn't understand, and as a teenager on the streets of the kingdom, let's call it Kerajaan Suryawana, he realized that soft hearts get crushed, quiet people get overlooked and exploited, but the loud, reckless, money-flinging gamblers, the charming, Boros characters, they get treated differently. They are annoying, but they are untouchable, because people assume anyone who can waste that much, anyone who will throw gold coins at dancers and stall keepers and bar owners, must have power backing them up, must have unseen patrons, and thus Udano invented a mask, the Topeng Pemboros, persona he could wear to keep predators at bay, to move through the underbelly of Suryawana while pretending to be the very thing he hated, a spoiled, irresponsible spendthrift. The opening scenes give us shards of this origin in glimpses. We see Udano as a child, kneeling beside the lifeless body of his mother in a cramped, candlelit room, the shadows of debt collectors stretching up the walls like demons, and Arya Wijaya lingers on small details, the way the mother's hand is still clinging to a bundle of rice, as if even in death she's trying to feed her child, the way young Udano's tears mix with the spilt coins scattered on the bamboo mat, coins that came too late or weren't enough, and over this, there is a flashback within the flashback, his mother teaching him a strange, fluid footwork pattern in a rice field at dusk, saying, Ingat, Dan, Langkaringan ini bukan untuk menyerang. Ini untuk bertahan hidup. Untuk selalu punya jalan keluar. Remember, this light step is not for attack, it's for survival, for always having a way out, and that tiny line of dialogue becomes this emotional landmine, because 15 years later, when we see the adult Udano weaving through a crowd with drunk, swaggering energy, you can tell that same survival footwork is still there, just hidden under layers of performance, and that realization hits you emotionally even if you don't consciously clock it at first. Time skips, a title card announces, Lima Belas Tahun Kemudian, and we're thrown into the bustling, sun-soaked chaos of Suryawana's market district, where Udano is now fully immersed in his spendthrift persona, his tossing coins at performers, laughing too loud, wearing lead, flamboyant batik with jangling jewelry, stumbling like he's had one too many palm wines, and some of the extras around him roll their eyes. Others flock to him because they know he's generous, but what the camera shows, presumably with a handheld, slightly unstable movement that mirrors his supposed drunkenness, is that his eyes are always scanning, always calculating. He notices the cutpurse before anyone else. He spots the palace soldiers shaking down a vegetable cellar. He drops coins not randomly but precisely where they'll cause the most distraction or the most goodwill, and the show hints very early that this man is not what he seems. One thing I really appreciated is that the series doesn't rush to explain his martial prowess. Instead, it spends time letting us live in his mask, letting us almost believe he's just a funny, morally flexible, slightly tragic clown, the kind of side character you'd expect to show up in a wuxia tavern scene to provide comic relief, and that's where the writing is clever, because it's subverting an archetype the audience is already familiar with, using our expectations as an extra layer of camouflage. It's only when the show brings in the larger political context, the fact that in the palace far above this chaotic market there is a princess, Putri Aining, already of marriageable age, and that the king has decided that instead of a purely arranged marriage, the kingdom will hold a grand tournament of skill and honor to choose her husband, that the narrative threads begin to converge, and Udano's apparently self-contained survival story starts to brush against the gears of history. Putri Aining herself is introduced in a way that immediately tells you she's not just a prize to be won. The first time we see her, she's not in some gilt cage in the palace, she's incognito in the same market Udano prowls, dressed as a commoner, buying herbal medicine from an old woman, and we get this tiny, wordless moment where she almost bumps into Udano as he spins around, flinging a cup of arak in exaggerated despair at losing a dice game, and the liquid splashes right by her sandals. Instead of recoiling or scolding him like some uptight noblewoman, she locks eyes with him for a split second, amused, almost impressed by his shamelessness, and then we cut away, and the moment is gone, but you feel the spark, that invisible theatre string tying them together long before either of them knows they are bound by palace politics. The background and release context of this show also matter to how it hits. 2025 has been a weirdly transitional year for streaming, but here's an Indonesian series that clearly has the budget and confidence to chase both local prestige and global exposure. The production uses real locations in Yogyakarta-esque landscapes, actual keratin architecture mixed with gorgeously built sets, every frame thick with carved wood, batik fabrics, wall lamps, and the kind of shadow play silhouettes that evoke wayang kulit, and it's obvious that the creative team is saying, we can play in the same league as any Asian or Western fantasy series, but we're going to do it our way. In interviews, which the show cleverly weaves into its marketing, the fictional Arya Wijaya talked about wanting to tell a story about economic trauma through the lens of a martial hero, and you can really feel that. Udano is not just a swordsman with a tragic past, his entire personality is a response to poverty and the helplessness of watching debt destroy his family, and that makes his wastefulness almost painfully ironic, because every coin he spends is also an act of defiance against the logic that said his mother's life was worth less than what she owed. As we move deeper into the story, the plot structure of this first episode is actually very elegant. We begin with Udano's origin, then 15 years later we establish his current life as a Pemboros who makes a living through gambling, information trading, and odd jobs, and at the same time we slowly introduce palace politics, King Prabharendra, aging and worried about succession, the dangerous, calculating party Raksita, the chancellor who likes things predictable and controlled, and of course Princess Aining, caught between duty and a quiet rebellion brewing inside her. The call for a tournament, this Poturungan Memalai Swami, to choose a husband, becomes the central event around which everyone's motivations orbit. Raksita sees it as a chance to shove his own puppet champion into the royal family. Rival clans see it as an opportunity to elevate their status. Neighboring states send their champions to maybe get an inside grip on Suryawana. And out in the city, the idea spreads like wildfire. You can almost feel the collective heartbeat of men who've spent their lives as nameless fighters suddenly daring to hope they could step into history, win the princess, and change their tribe's fate. What the show does well is that it never reduces this tournament to a simple bracket. Instead, it treats it like a political earthquake that shakes every social layer of Suryawana, from the palace to the slums, and Udano initially wants nothing to do with it. There's a key scene where his only real friend, a street performer named Lembayung, a woman who plays the rebab and juggles knives with a smile that never entirely hides her own haunted past, teases him. Kalau kau berhenti pura-pura jadi orang boros dan mulai menggunakan langkah-langkah aneh yang kau sembunyikan itu, mungkin kau juga bisa ikut bertarung demi Putri Aining, and Udano just laughs it off, spills more coins, and says something like, Aku sudah memalai istriku. Namanya kebebasan. Dia posif sekali, I've already chosen my wife, her name is Freedom, and she's very possessive, and the line lands as a joke, but the way he avoids eye contact, the way his hand clenches around the coin until his knuckles go white, lets you know there's more going on inside. This is where the performance of whoever plays Udano, let's imagine a breakout performance by a relatively new actor, maybe someone like Iqbal Ramadan but older and rougher, really shines. He has to play multiple layers at once, Udano the clown, Udano the overcompensating survivor, and the latent, coiled martial artist who promised his dying mother that he would never again be helpless. And he has to do it in a way that doesn't feel like obvious telegraphing. The actor pulls it off with tiny details, the way his shoulders drop when he thinks no one's looking, the deadness that sometimes flashes in his eyes right after a big laugh, the slight over-precision of his drunk stumble that tells you it's choreographed rather than truly tipsy. Cinematically, the series also loves contrasts. The market scenes are all warm golds and oranges, shaky camera, noise, overlapping dialogue, while the palace is cool blues and greens, with symmetrical frames and slow, gliding tracking shots that emphasize hierarchy and control. We get scenes of Putri Aining being instructed in court etiquette, her ladies-in-waiting fussing over her hair and kebaya, while outside her window the sound of drums and cheering floats in as the city celebrates the upcoming tournament. She's both fascinated and resentful, curious about these warriors who will fight to win her, but also painfully aware that she herself does not get to choose her fate. And the actor playing her, maybe someone like Tara Basro or a rising younger actor, gives Aining a quiet steel that's really compelling. Early on, there's a sharp scene where she confronts her father gently but firmly, saying, Ayah memanggil pendekar dari seluruh negeri untuk membuktikan bahwa mereka layak menjadi suami. Tapi siapa yang akan membuktikan bahwa suami itu layak mendapatkan aku, which loosely means, you're calling warriors from all over to prove that they deserve to be my husband, but who will prove that husband deserves me? And the king, played with a weary kindness that's constantly undercut by his own political weakness, just looks away, unable to answer. And that silence says as much about gender and power as any big speech could. One of the strengths of Topeng Pemboros is how it balances these character beats with the slow unveiling of Udano's true capabilities. The writers could have easily gone for immediate spectacle, giving us a big fight early on to show he's secretly strong, but instead they hold back, building tension through almost fights, interrupted confrontations, and small hints. There's a fantastic sequence halfway through the episode where some palace guards, annoyed by Udano's presence near the palace walls, he's actually there on a side job, smuggling letters for a minor noble, decide to teach this drunken spendthrift a lesson. They shove him into an alleyway, draw their blades, and the way the camera frames it, you can see how narrow the space is, how easily blood could splatter on those mossy bricks, and there's a quick cut back to Udano's childhood, trapped in A similar narrow space as debt collectors cornered his mother. Instead of snapping into heroic mode, Udano at first leans deeper into his act, stumbling, apologizing, dropping coins on purpose so the guards bend to pick them up, and you almost shouting at the screen, because you can see in his eyes that he wants to unleash something, but the fear of revealing himself is stronger. At the last second, he uses that old rice field footwork, slipping through the smallest opening in the line of guards, never actually throwing a punch, and you can see them get confused because one moment he's in front, the next he's behind them, tossing another handful of coins, laughing like an idiot, yet they can't lay a hand on him. The scene is choreographed like a fight, with all the rhythms and beats of combat, but it's technically just avoidance, and that choice says so much about where Udano is emotionally. He's capable, but he's not ready to step into the light. The catalyst that finally pushes him toward the tournament, and thus toward revealing his true identity and power, is of course connected back to his mother, and this is where the writing really leans into melodrama in the best way. We learn in pieces that his mother wasn't just a poor woman crushed by debt, she was once connected to a hidden martial sect, perhaps the legendary Paguruan Lanka Ibu, a small, almost mythic clan whose style focused on evasive footwork and redirection rather than brute strength, a style that made them both feared and hated by more straightforward warrior clans, and there is an old rumor, spread quietly, and definitely not lost on the cunning party Waxita, that the last scroll of their technique ended up in the hands of a low-born woman in Suryawana. That woman, of course, was Udano's mother, and the reason debt collectors just happened to be in the village the night she died might not have been random at all. As the tournament draws nearer, fighters from all over begin to flood the city, and one of them is Jagapati, a brutal swordsman affiliated with Raksita, whose job is not only to compete but also quietly search for any trace of that lost Paguruan Lanka Ibu technique. The moment he hears of a slippery drunk in the market who never seems to get caught, his interest is piqued. One night, as rain pounds the cobblestones and the marketplace is almost empty, Jagapati orchestrates a trap, using Lembayung as bait. He knows Udano is soft where it counts, that for all his selfish showmanship he can't leave a friend in danger, and the scene that follows is, in my opinion, the true turning point of the episode, the first full-on fight where the mask begins to crack. Lembayung is cornered in a warehouse, the flickering lanterns casting long, twitching shadows as Jagapati's men circle around her. She throws knives with admirable skill but is clearly outmatched, and when Udano bursts in, panting, soaked in rain, his face plastered still with that performative grin, you can see the resolve harden behind his eyes as he takes in the situation. At first he tries his old tricks, coins flung to startle, jokes to throw people off balance, but Jagapati sees right through it, pushing his men aside and stepping into the circle with a hungry smile. Akad Dengar Kau Pandai Menginda, Pemboros. Tapi Kalau Yang Kau Lindungi Adala Orang Yang Penting, Mazi Baisaka Kau Lari. Translation: I hear you're good at dodging, spendthrift. But if the person you're protecting is important, can you still run? And that's the question that cuts straight to the core of Udano's trauma, because his entire life has been defined by running, by escaping, by not being able to save the one person who mattered most. So when Jagapati lunges toward Lembayung with killing intent, Udano's body moves before his mind does, and for the first time we see the hidden style awaken fully. The choreography here is stunning, the camera drops to low angles, emphasizing the weird, gliding quality of his steps, almost as if he's skating over the wet floor, every pivot a callback to that sunny rice field lesson. The sound design softens all other noise, amplifying the brush of his sandals on the ground, the faint clicks of joints as he turns. He doesn't meet Jagapati's blade directly. Instead, he's always just an inch out of reach, hand brushing the flat of the sword to redirect, body folding and unfolding like a reed in the wind, and while it's beautiful to watch, it's also tense, because you can feel his hesitation. He still doesn't want to kill. The fight ends, crucially, not with a death but with a compromise. Udano disarms Jagapati in a breathtaking burst of motion, using what we later learn is one of the signature moves of Lanka Ibu, Jejak Terakir, the final footprint, which uses an opponent's forward momentum to spin them into a lock, press them to the ground, and leave them with their weapon at their own throat. For a suspended heartbeat, he has the chance to end Jagapati, to stop this threat permanently, but he hears his mother's voice in his head, not as some mystical echo but as a fragmented memory. Lanka ini bukan untuk membuna, dan ini untuk membuatmu selalu punya pilihan. This step is not for killing, it's to make sure you always have a choice. Instead of slitting his enemy's throat, he simply whispers, "Jangan sentuh dia lagi, don't touch her again, and let's Jagapati live." That mercy will have consequences, but in the moment it reads as a triumph of his better nature over the bitterness that's been driving him. It's that fight, and the rumors it sparks, whispers of a nameless man who fought like a ghost and made a notorious swordsman taste the ground, that finally draw the attention of the palace. From here, the narrative threads converge quickly. Party Raksita wants to identify and control this fighter, suspecting a connection to the lost clan. King Rendra sees him as a potential wild card who could stand between the princess and the chancellor's manipulations. Putri Aining, hearing about the mysterious protector in the market, begins to imagine that not all the men competing for her hand are arrogant nobles or brutal mercenaries, and Lembeyang, shaken but alive, pushes Udano toward something he's been resisting. Their conversation the morning after the fight is one of the emotional highlights of the episode. They sit on a rooftop as dawn paints the city in pale pink, Udano bruised and exhausted, Lembeyang's voice hoarse from both fear and gratitude, and she tells him, "Selama 15 tahun kau pakai topeng ini, dan Topeng Pemboros yang keras kepala, yang pura-pura tidak peduli, yang pura-pura tidak pernah takut. Tapi semalam, aku lihat wajahmu sendiri. Bukankah kau lelah? For 15 years you've worn this mask. This stubborn spendthrift mask that pretends not to care, pretends never to be afraid. But last night, I saw your real face. Aren't you tired?" And he responds with this heartbreaking mix of vulnerability and deflection, saying something like, "Kalau aku buka topengku, dunia akan lihat aku lima lagi. Dan dunia tidak pernah ramah pada orang yang lima. If I take off my mask, the world will see me as weak again, and the world is never kind to the weak." That line, delivered quietly, not in some big screaming fit, really stayed with me, because it crystallizes the show's central theme, that sometimes we cling to the very defense mechanisms that are slowly killing us, because the alternative, being seen in our raw, unprotected state, sounds even scarier. From a cinematic standpoint, the rooftop scene is also beautifully framed. The camera keeps distance at first, showing these two small figures against the sprawling city, emphasizing their insignificance in the grand scheme, and then slowly, as the conversation deepens, it creeps closer, until we're tight on their faces, catching every twitch of muscle, every tear that refuses to fall. This is where the performances really carry the weight. Lembeyang's actor in particular deserves a shout-out, because she imbues a role that could have been just the plucky friend, with layers of anger, tenderness, and a quiet self-loathing that comes from a life on the margins. She sees through Udano because she shares his survival instinct, but she also envies his ability to pretend, to wear that mask with such conviction. The writing also gives her some of the sharpest little jabs, like when she says, with a half-smile, "Kau kira kau satu-satunya yang pakai topeng di kota ini. You think you're the only one who wears a mask in this city." In terms of pacing, this first episode is surprisingly patient. It doesn't rush Udano into the tournament arena until the final act, and that choice gives his eventual decision real weight. You feel the push and pull, his desire to remain invisible battling with his hatred for Raksita, his simmering empathy for Aining, whom he still only knows as the girl from the market and the distant royal figure whose fate is being auctioned off, and his loyalty to Lembeyang and others like her, people who will suffer if the wrong man takes the princess's hand and thus the future of the kingdom. By the time we reach the day of the tournament's first round, we as the audience have been steeped in the stakes. We've seen the cruelty of Raksita's methods, the way he intimidates lesser nobles and quietly arranges accidents for potential threats. We've seen how deeply Aining despises the idea of being a prize, her conversations with her handmaid, in which she admits she's thought about running away, only to be reminded that her absence would plunge the kingdom into chaos. We've seen Udano standing in the crowd, up on that rooftop, watching the banners being raised over the palace with equal parts longing and resentment. When he finally walks up to the registration table, still in his noisy embroidered clothes, slouching like a man on his way to a tavern rather than an arena, and casually drops the sign-up token onto the wooden surface, the look on the registrar's face mirrors our own: confusion, disbelief, curiosity. The progression into the tournament itself is where Topeng Pemboros gets to flex its action chops, and this is where the series really shines cinematographically. The arena is an open courtyard inside the palace complex, encircled by carved stone stands where nobles sit under colorful canopies and commoners press against the outer gates just to glimpse the spectacle. the soundtrack swells with gamelan that has been subtly blended with more modern percussive elements, giving the fights a propulsive, almost heartbeat-like rhythm. The first few matches we see are between other fighters, giving us a sense of the variety of styles: heavy axe wielders from the northern hills, agile knife dancers from the coastal tribes, a dignified staff user from a monastic order. Each fight is shot with a different style to reflect the fighter's approaches: long takes for the disciplined monk, rapid cuts for the feral coastal kid, and it's a smart way for the show to honor the diversity of Nusantara martial traditions while also simply being entertaining. When Udano's turn comes, there's a collective murmuring in the stands. Nobles snicker at his ostentatious clothes, some commoners cheer because they recognize him as the generous Pemboros from the markets, and up in the royal pavilion, we see three crucial reactions: Aining leaning forward, curious, Raksita narrowing his eyes, suspicious, and King Rendra watching with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing that wild cards can upset even the best-laid political plans. Udano's first opponent is a hulking brawler from a mountain clan, a man who fights with brute force and a massive mace. And the initial setup looks almost comically mismatched. The brawler cracks the ground with each swing while Udano dances just out of range, taunting him with jokes and exaggerated fear. But those who watched the warehouse fight know what's really happening. It's Lanka Ibu in disguise again, evasive footwork cloaked in clownish movement. Cinematically, the fight escalates brilliantly. At first the camera stays wide, letting us appreciate the patterns the fighters are carving into the dust. Then it starts to cut in more as the brawler grows frustrated, his attacks sloppier, his breathing heavier, while Udano's movement remains infuriatingly relaxed. For those of us watching at home, the tension isn't in whether Udano will win. By now we're pretty confident in his skill. It's in whether he'll let the mask slip fully, whether the nobles and martial experts in the stands will recognize the forbidden technique. The climax of the fight comes when the brawler finally corners Udano near the edge of the arena. There's nowhere left to dodge, dust swirling around their feet, the crowd roaring for blood, and for a heartbeat, the camera goes handheld, the frame wobbling as if it's been knocked off balance just like Udano. Then, Udano's demeanor cracks, the lazy grin disappears, replaced by a moment of naked concentration, and we get a close-up of his bare feet shifting in that now familiar pattern, the same taught in the rice field, the same used in the warehouse. The sound drops out again, replaced only by a faint echo of his mother's voice humming that lullaby we heard at the very beginning, and then he moves. In one fluid motion, he steps into the brawler's swing instead of back from it, turns his body, lets the mace's momentum draw the larger man off balance, and uses the force to flip him clean over his shoulder, slamming him into the dust with a force that leaves the whole arena silent. There's a second of shocked stillness, and then the crowd erupts. It's that reaction, the way the silence breaks into a thunder, that makes you feel the emotional magnitude of this moment. For Udano, it's the first time his true self has been applauded rather than punished, the first time using his mother's legacy in public didn't lead to blood and loss, and the camera lingers on his face as he processes that, a flicker of wonder mixed with terror. But even in that triumph, the seeds of danger are being sown. Up in the royal box, you see Raksita's eyes widen in recognition, jaw tensing as he whispers something to Jagapati beside him. The swordsman, still bearing the bruises from Udano's earlier mercy, clenches his fists in clenched, humiliated fury. Aining, on the other hand, looks almost relieved, as if seeing a fighter who wins with grace and intelligence rather than sheer brutality gives her a ray of hope that maybe, just maybe, this tournament won't end with her life shackled to a monster. Rendra watches all this, the politician in him calculating, the father in him giving a small nod that is both approval and apology to his daughter, approval that a worthy man might be emerging, apology that she has to sit there as a prize. As a viewer, you feel the layers piling up. Udano has stepped into the arena, but he's also stepped onto a stage where every move will be scrutinized by people who see him as pawn, threat, or miracle. The latter half of the episode builds on that momentum, alternating between more rounds of the tournament and the deepening entanglement of the main characters. We're careful here not to spoil every beat, but there are some standout moments worth touching on. There's a quiet scene where Aining, unable to restrain her curiosity, asks her trusted handmaiden to find out more about this Pemboros Pendekar, the spendthrift warrior, and through a bit of palace servant gossip network magic, she learns of his reputation in the city, his generosity, his drunken theatrics, the way he always pays his debts even when he loses. The information both shocks and intrigues her. She's grown up around nobles who hoard wealth and are stingy with compassion, so the idea of a man who throws money away not out of carelessness but as a kind of shield for others forces her to reconsider what wasteful really means. Meanwhile, Udano struggles more than he expected with the emotional impact of finally fighting all out. He experiences flashes of his mother's death during rest periods between matches, his hands trembling as he tightens his grip on his weapon, a simple staff, notably, not a flashy sword or spear, another subtle nod to his reluctance to kill. Lem Beiyang stays at his side, massaging his aching shoulders, cracking jokes to keep his nerves in check, but she also pushes him to confront the bigger picture. Kau tahu kan, kalau kau tiras menang, kau bukan cuma akan dapat emas. Kau bisa mengubah siapa yang duduk di samping putri di singgasana itu. Kau tahu apa artinya buat kami. You know that if you keep winning, you won't just get gold. You can change who sits beside the princess on that throne. You know what that means for people like us. And he does know, which is why the weight on his shoulders grows heavier with each round. Thematically, this is where Topeng Pemboros becomes less about a single tournament and more about the question of what we owe each other. The show keeps returning to this idea that Udano's mask wasn't just about hiding, it was about refusing responsibility. If you're just a clown, if you're just the guy who wastes his money and staggers through life, no one expects you to change anything. You can survive, quietly bitter, and tell yourself you're not part of the problem because you never held a sword for the powerful. But once you step into the arena, reveal that you can fight, people will start to look to you, to project their hopes and desperation onto your shoulders. That's terrifying, and the show doesn't sugarcoat it. There's even a scene where Udano contemplates throwing a match, staging a loss, simply to slip back into anonymity, and the turmoil he goes through in that moment is a powerful commentary on how easy it is to romanticize heroism from the outside, and how much it can feel like a trap from the inside. On the technical side, this whole section of the series really showcases the craft of the fight choreographers and cinematographer, instead of escalating only in spectacle, bigger weapons, bigger explosions, the fights also escalate emotionally. Each opponent Udano faces represents a different path he could have taken. One is a noble-born fighter who hides his insecurities under rigid honor codes, another is a mercenary who embraces his own dehumanization, seeing himself as a tool rather than a person, and in each clash, Udano isn't just dodging blades, he's grappling with a possible version of himself. The camera and editing reflect that by increasingly diving into his POV, blurring the edges of the frame, distorting sound at key moments, so that by the time he steps into what appears to be the final big match of the episode against Jagapati, we feel just as disoriented and on edge as he does. Now, I won't go into blow-by-blow detail of that climactic duel, because it deserves to be experienced with fresh eyes, but there are some aspects that are worth analyzing. First, the way the show parallels it with flashbacks. As Udano and Jagapati circle each other, trading barbs and probing strikes, we cut back to young Udano watching another duel, one that ended in his mother's death, and the intercutting serves to heighten the stakes without resorting to cheesy slow motion. Second, the way the duel is lit. It takes place near sunset, the arena bathed in an almost blood-red glow, long shadows stretching across the sand, and as the fight intensifies, clouds gradually cover the sun, plunging the scene into a moody half-darkness. It sounds on the nose, but the execution is subtle enough that it feels more like the world holding its breath than some obvious metaphor. Third, the choice Udano faces at the fight's climax echoes the earlier warehouse confrontation yet pushes it to a much more brutal extreme, forcing him to decide, in a split second, whether to stay true to his mother's non-lethal philosophy or to accept that sometimes, to protect many, one must fall. The show's decision about that moment, whether he kills or spares Jagapati, will likely be debated by fans for a while, because it's not clean or easy. It's framed as a tragedy, regardless of which path the writers choose, and it's one of the reasons this series feels emotionally richer than a standard martial arts story. Beyond the core plot and epic duels, what makes Topeng Pemboros resonate is its exploration of grief and identity. Udano's entire life is shaped by a loss he never really processed. He turned it into a performance, kind of weaponized apathy, and the show is, in many ways, about the slow, painful process of taking that armor off. We see this not only in his interactions with Lem Beiyang but also in the way he starts to think about Aining. Initially, she's an abstract symbol, a princess far above his station, someone whose fate has nothing to do with his besides the distant ripple effects of royal politics. But as he catches more glimpses of her, as he sees her rigid posture in the royal box soften when she thinks no one's looking, as he hears, through gossip and whispers, about her attempts to negotiate with her father for more say in her own future, he begins to see her as another person trapped by a different kind of mask. There's this poignant moment, late in the episode, where Udano, still disguised as a commoner, ends up back in the market at night and spots Aining once again moving through the stalls incognito, this time clearly shaken by something, perhaps a heated argument with her father about the tournament. He recognizes her despite the humble clothes because of the way she carries herself, that mixture of poise and restlessness, and there's this extended, almost wordless sequence where he follows at a careful distance, watching her interact with vendors, listening to her ask honest, earnest questions about their lives. She asks a fishmonger how the tournament will affect business, and the woman says, "Kalau swami putri orang baik, mungkin pajak tidak akan naik lagi." If the princess's husband is a good man, maybe taxes won't go up again, and Aining visibly flinches at the reminder that her marriage will be felt in very concrete ways by people who don't even know her name. Udano sees this, sees the guilt flicker across her face, and for the first time, the idea of winning the tournament stops being about proving his strength or avenging his mother and starts being about protecting someone else's agency, someone who never asked to be put on a pedestal. This is where the emotional stakes really crystallize. He's not just fighting to drop his own mask, he's fighting to let someone else drop theirs too. Thematically, the show keeps circling this idea that everyone in Suryawana is wearing a mask. Udano's is obvious, Aining's is gilded and polite, Raksita's is smooth and loyal while hiding ruthless ambition, even King Rendra's jovial Father King act conceals a deep cowardice and regret. In one of the few explicitly symbolic scenes, we see an actual Topeng dance performed in the palace hall as part of a festival. Dancers in elaborate wooden masks reenact old legends of heroes and demons while the nobility claps and drinks, and intercut with this pageantry are shots of the real, mask performances happening outside, the way vendors flatter rich clients, the way underlings laugh at unfunny jokes from their bosses, the way Lembayang swallows her fear to flirt with dangerous men. For tips. It's a striking montage that drives home the point that the entire culture is built on performance, and that someone who insists on being truly themselves will be seen as either a threat or a fool. That's what makes Udano's journey so compelling. His challenge is not just in beating opponents, it's in being willing to be fully seen. On a meta level, there's something very 2025 about this as well. We live in an era of curated identities, of social media flexing where people pretend to be wealthier, happier, more carefree than they really are, and Udano is, in some ways, an extreme, period drama version of that phenomenon. He literally flexes, throwing money around, presenting himself as someone who doesn't care about consequences, and people both envy and despise him for it, never guessing that it's all a trauma response. The series doesn't hammer this parallel too hard, but it's impossible not to think about it as you watch him perform his persona for an audience that only ever half believes him. In terms of performances, we've talked a lot about Udano and Lembayang and Aining, but there are other standout characters as well. Raksita, the party, could have been a one-note villain, but the actor layers him with skepticism and weariness that almost makes him understandable. He truly believes that the kingdom is too fragile to be left in the hands of idealists, that order must be maintained at any cost, and while his methods are reprehensible, his motivation comes from a distorted sense of responsibility rather than pure selfishness. There's a powerful scene where he stands alone in the empty arena after the day's matches are over, staring down at the blood-stained sand, and mutters to himself, "Rakyat hanya lihat darah hari ini. Mereka tidak pernah lihat darah yang tidak jadi tanpa karena akan membuat keputusan kota." The people only see the blood that spills today. They never see the blood that didn't spill because I made dirty decisions. It's a chilling line that doesn't absolve him but complicates him, making him more than just the cackling mastermind. Even minor characters, like the head of the palace guards who secretly trains village children in basic self-defense, or the gruff old herbalist who tends fighters' wounds while cursing them for their stupidity, are sketched with enough detail to feel real. That richness of the supporting cast gives the world of Topeng Pemboros a lived-in texture that strengthens the central story. You believe this is a society with its own rhythms and pressures, not just a backdrop for cool fights. From an audience reaction standpoint, it's been interesting to see how people have latched onto different aspects of the show. Some viewers are here purely for the action and have been breaking down the choreography on social media, pointing out specific Pencak Silat influences in Udano's movements, comparing them to classic films, and praising the decision to favor practical stunts over heavy CGI. Others have been geeking out over the costume and set design, noting details like the way Aining's outfits subtly shift from rigid, heavily structured garments in palace scenes to slightly looser, more breathable fabrics when she's in disguise, symbolizing her longing for freedom. But a lot of the online conversation has surprisingly centered on the emotional themes, people sharing their own stories of masks they've worn to survive, memes about the Topeng Pemboros being the ultimate trauma-induced flex persona, and even some fan art reimagining Yudano in modern-day Jakarta, throwing credit cards around in a nightclub while secretly just trying to avoid thinking about his past. That kind of resonance is not something you can fake. It suggests that the writers tapped into something genuinely universal. Culturally, the impact of a series like this is also significant. For Indonesian viewers, there's a real pride in seeing local martial traditions and court culture depicted with this level of care and cinematic flair, not just as exotic set dressing but as the backbone of a story with global emotional stakes. For international viewers who find the show on streaming platforms, it can serve as a gateway into a whole different flavor of martial fantasy than the more widely exported Chinese and Japanese examples. There's a distinct sense of place here, the gamelan rhythms, the wayang references, the layered etiquette of the keratin, that gives Topeng Pemboros a unique identity, and that identity is crucial to its success. It's not trying to be a knockoff of another country's genre, it's staking its own claim. Now, does the episode land perfectly in every aspect? Not quite. If we're being honest, the pacing around the middle, right before the tournament starts, sags a bit. There are a few scenes of palace politicking and minor character backstories that, while interesting on their own, could have been tightened to keep the momentum going. Some viewers might also find the heavy use of slow motion at emotional peaks a bit too much. There's a particular shot of Yudano catching a falling coin, his mother's locket flashing around his neck, that lingers just a hair longer than it needs to, tipping from poetic into slightly melodramatic. But these are relatively minor quibbles in the grand scheme of things, especially when weighed against how much this first episode gets right. The emotional through line of Yudano's journey is consistently compelling, the action is inventive and grounded, the world-building feels authentic, and the central relationship between Yudano and the absent yet ever-present memory of his mother gives the show a heart that's hard to shake. By the time the credits roll on this first installment, you're not just asking, will he win the tournament? You're asking, who will he be if he does, and what will it cost him to finally take off that mask? The final minutes of the episode, which I won't fully spoil, deliver a gut punch of a twist regarding Yudano's lineage, hinting that his connection to the royal family and the martial world is even more deeply entwined than we thought, and set up a tantalizing question about whether the spendthrift identity he's constructed is going to be strong enough to withstand the tidal wave of expectations that are about to crash over him. And that, to me, is the sign of a truly successful pilot or first episode. It completes an internal arc. You see Yudano move from total avoidance to tentative engagement with his destiny, while opening up a whole universe of new conflicts and possibilities. So, in terms of a verdict, if you're someone who loves martial arts cinema but is tired of one-dimensional macho heroes, if you're someone who's interested in stories about how people use performance to cope with pain, if you're someone who wants to see Indonesian culture rendered with both love and critical thought, Topeng Pemboros episode is absolutely worth your time. It's not just about a man who pretends to be wasteful, it's about the cost of that pretense, about the way grief can distort your sense of self, and about the terrifying, exhilarating process of stepping out from behind the persona you built to survive and discovering whether there's still something real left underneath. Watching Yudano navigate that path, stumbling, joking, fighting, retreating, advancing, is an emotional journey that lingers, and as the camera pulls back in the episode's final wide shot, showing him standing alone in the now empty arena, his shadow long and uncertain in the twilight, you can't help but feel that same tug in your own chest, that same whisper of a question: if I took off my own mask, who would I be? And would the world have a place for that version of me? So if you're still here and you said, yes, that already tells me something about you, because Topeng Pemboros episode is not the kind of series you watch with half your attention while scrolling your phone. It's the kind of series that quietly digs its fingers into you and refuses to let go, and if you want more, then let's really go deeper into the layers that make this story so strangely haunting and so unexpectedly relevant. Even though it's wrapped in court robes and ancient steel, there's Something I haven't really unpacked yet about the emotional engine of this series, which is the way Udano's grief never fully heals, it just shapeshifts, and the writers are clever enough never to turn that grief into a spectacle, they let it exist mostly in the background of his choices. Think about it, almost every major turning point for him connects back to his mother's last lesson or to that sense of having been so small, so powerless, that the only weapon left to him was to become morally slippery, to never let anybody know where his true center was, and when we see him as an adult, still clinging to that strategy, we're looking at a trauma response that has ossified into a lifestyle. The show doesn't use the language of therapy, obviously, this is a wuxia-flavored period piece, but emotionally that's exactly what's going on, a coping mechanism that once saved him now begins to trap him, and the narrative is basically about whether he can grow beyond it without losing the good it allowed him to do. And that's where Topeng Pemboros episode really stands apart from more straightforward heroes' journeys, because we're not just watching a guy go from weak to strong, we're watching him try to decide if he can afford to become honest in a world that punishes honesty from people like him. One of the finer touches in the middle portion of the series is how the side characters slowly start to react differently to Udano once little fragments of his true self slip out. Not in huge dramatic reveals, but in these slivers of behavior. A servant girl notices that he always eats last when they share a meal. An old gambler who thought Udano was just easy prey realizes that the losing streaks were deliberately staged to keep thugs away from more vulnerable players, and even Rexardi, Mr. Honor and Duty himself, reluctantly acknowledges that beneath the tomfoolery there is a discipline that looks nothing like his own but is just as real. These small awakenings in other people create a kind of echo chamber, a second network of perception that runs underneath the official court narrative. And the show is very interested in that gap between what the powerful think is happening and what the people actually feel is happening. Visually, you can even see it. The nobles' scenes often take place in bright, open courtyards or ostentatious chambers where everything is lit and visible, while the true conversations, the ones that really move the story's heart, happen in shadowed kitchens, lantern-lit back alleys, quiet storerooms full of ledgers and dust, and that contrast reinforces the core theme. Truth lives in the places most people don't bother to look. The competition for Putri Aining's hand is the big flashy excuse for gathering all these characters together, but by the mid-episodes, you start feeling that the marriage itself is almost secondary compared to the question of who will actually shape the future of the kingdom, and this is where Aining herself becomes absolutely central, not as a trophy bride, but as a political and moral force. One of my favorite sequences is a scene that doesn't involve any swords at all. Aining sits with a map of the kingdom spread in front of her, and a lower official is explaining which regions have been pleading for relief from drought and which have been sending in fewer taxes. Her ladies-in-waiting fuss around her with jewelry and fabrics, talking about what colors will look best when she appears at the next trial, and the contrast is almost painful. This woman is expected to concern herself with silk shades while she's quietly calculating crop failures and border tensions. The camera lingers on her hands, one resting on a river drawn in ink, the other being draped with bangles, and you can see the metaphor right there. She is caught between ornament and responsibility, the cultural resonance of that image, especially for women watching in societies that still box them into roles of decor and obedience, is huge, and you could feel it in the way audiences latched onto her as more than the princess. They started calling her Ratu Tersembunyi, the hidden queen, because we're watching someone who hasn't been crowned but is already thinking like a ruler. It's her gradual recognition of Udano's real nature that becomes the moral axis of the story, because Aining is the closest thing this series has to a clear-eyed judge. She's not infallible, she's angry, she's naive in some ways, but she is deeply, almost painfully committed to justice, and when someone like that looks at Udano and decides he is more than his mask, that decision lands with weight. There's a pivotal conversation between them in one of the palace gardens, late at night, where the air is thick with the scent of wet earth after a light rain, and fireflies dot the scene with these tiny sparks of moving light. It's romantic on the surface, sure, but the tone of the dialogue is anything but soft. She confronts him, basically, I've seen you choose people over power, yet you still pretend power is your only language. Who are you actually? And his response is not some sweeping declaration, it's this tired, bitter little laugh, and he says something like, who I actually am has never kept me alive. Why should I trust it now? And that exchange hits like a brick, because it strips away the fantasy varnish and gets to a very real question so many of us wrestle with. If being authentic has cost you in the past, how do you ever convince yourself it's worth it again? The show is full of those conversations that sound like they belong in another genre, something more introspective, but they are woven into the swords and schemes tapestry so naturally that they don't feel forced, in terms of craft. The dialogue always tries to do three things at once: advance the plot, reveal character, and underlying theme, and when it's firing on all cylinders, you feel that triple punch. Of course, it's not perfect. There are a handful of scenes where someone spells out the moral a bit too clearly, or a villain monologues longer than they need to, but for the most part, Topeng Pemboros episode trusts you to read context, to pick up on what's left unsaid. Now, we should talk a bit more about the antagonistic forces, because a story like this only feels as strong as the world it's resisting. The Emperor is not portrayed as a cackling tyrant or a secret saint. He's a man drowning in the weight of maintaining an empire, someone who began with ideals but learned, over decades, to accept cruelty as practicality. There's a moment late in the season where he tells Aining, "Mercy feeds one village. Fear feeds a kingdom," and the way he says it is not triumphant, it's almost mournful, like he's trying to convince himself as much as her. He embodies the old logic of power, the belief that order is worth any price, and that belief is what puts him on a collision course with Udano's quiet rebellion. Then there's the Prime Minister, who plays the classic role of the spider in the web, managing information, bribery, and blackmail. But what keeps him from being just another scheming courtier is the way the show hints at his background. He came from nothing, clawed his way up through the bureaucracy, and now genuinely believes that the only way to protect the kingdom from collapsing under its own contradictions is to keep manipulating everything from behind the scenes. To him, idealists like Udano are dangerous precisely because they have enough charisma and cunning to disrupt the fragile balance he's spent his life maintaining. In other words, the villains of Topeng Pemboros episode are not evil for evil's sake. They are people who have chosen stability over justice so many times that they can no longer see the difference. And that's a much scarier, more realistic kind of antagonism. One episode that really crystallizes this comes when an outlying province threatens rebellion over unfair grain taxes. The Emperor's council debates sending troops. Rexardi is ready to march. Sogura suggests letting it burn to show the others what happens when they defy the center, and all the while Udano and Aining are quietly sketching out a different kind of solution on the margins of the conversation, one that involves debt forgiveness, structural reforms, and rotating crop strategies. Of course, their plan is dismissed at first as soft, naive, but when we later see the troops bogged down in muddy terrain, demoralized and poorly supplied, and the rebellion no closer to being quelled, the earlier, soft, plan begins to look like actual foresight. What makes that arc powerful is the way it binds military conflict to economic injustice and then to personal consequence. We meet a young soldier from Udano's home village drafted into the campaign. We see the fear in his wife's eyes, we see the letters that never make it home, and suddenly the distant concept of rebellion in the provinces becomes terrifyingly intimate. Once again, the show reminds us that behind every grand policy are individual lives being spent like coins, and that brings us back to the title, the spendthrift mask, which operates on so many levels it's almost excessive. There's the literal waste of money Udano performs to conceal his true prudence, the figurative waste of human potential the palace tolerates to keep the machine moving, and then the emotional waste of all the love, care, and truth people lock away because they think the world won't value it. Time and again, we see characters reach for connection and then stop themselves, choosing safety instead, and those tiny hesitations accumulate into a kind of ambient sadness that hovers over the entire series. It's not a grimdark show. There is humor, warmth, and genuine joy, but there is always that undertow of what might have been if we'd been braver sooner, and that is, honestly, where the show hits hardest. One of the boldest creative choices is how the later episodes stop pretending that the competition for Aining's hand is a simple game that will end with a single triumphant winner. As the palace fractures under the strain of exposed corruption and external threats, the trials become less about formal duels and more about real crisis management. There's a flood that threatens to breach the city walls, an assassination attempt during a religious ceremony, a food shortage that leads to looting in the lower quarters, and in each of these scenarios, we see the would-be suitors tested in real time, not in staged arenas but in the messy, chaotic reality of governance. Udano in particular comes alive in these episodes, because this is his true battlefield. Logistics, morale, improvisation. He's not the fastest with a sword, he can't outmatch Rexardi in pure combat or Sogura in raw ferocity, but in the chaos of a collapsing grain store or a panicking crowd, his understanding of human behavior, his ability to read fear and redirect it, becomes the most valuable skill in the room. There's a breathtaking scene where a panicked rumor starts to spread that the palace wells have been poisoned, and the crowd is on the verge of turning violent. The guards are ready to draw weapons, the ministers are screaming for the gates to be closed, but Udano walks right into the middle of the chaos, grabs a cup, and drinks directly from the supposedly tainted well. For a moment, everything is silent, all eyes on him, and he just grins that familiar fool's grin and says something like, "If I die, at least I didn't have to pay for the drink," and the crowd bursts into a shaky kind of laughter, the tension diffused just enough for Reason to re-enter the room. Later, we see him privately take herbs to counter mild stomach upset because, of course, he knew the well was safe. He had already traced the rumor to a disgruntled merchant trying to manipulate prices, but the courage to put his body on the line, in front of everyone, is what shifts the people's perception from harmless clown to something more dangerous, someone who can move hearts, and that shift is not lost on Aining or on the Prime Minister or on the Emperor himself. From then on, every action Udano takes is watched with a new wariness, and the net around him tightens. One of the tragedies of the show is that the more he steps into his true power, the more he paints a target on his back, and yet, he can't go back, not really, because once you've tasted what it's like to act in alignment with your values, instead of always twisting yourself to survive, mere survival feels like a smaller, duller life. The story understands that metamorphosis intimately. As the political storm intensifies, the personal stakes between Udano and Aining deepen too, but not in the way you might expect. There's never a neat confession scene where they declare undying love and everything gets solved with a kiss. Instead, their closeness is expressed through acts of trust and shared risk. She smuggles him key information. At great danger to herself, he refuses an opportunity to escape the palace in order to stay and protect her father, the very man whose policies he opposes. Each of those choices says, "I care about you," louder than any romantic monologue could, and the show is very aware of the limitations of their situation. She is a princess with responsibilities that span millions of lives. He is a man whose very existence destabilizes the narrative the court has been running for years. Any union between them would be fraught, not just emotionally but structurally, and the writers don't gloss over that. You feel it in the way their conversations always carry a thread of sorrow even at their most hopeful. They are not just asking, "Can we be together?" They are asking, "Can we build a world where being together doesn't mean betraying everyone else?" And that's a much harder, much more adult question, on a meta level. This is part of why Topeng Pemboros episode resonated so strongly with older viewers. And not just younger fans of fantasy action. It's a story about idealism colliding with systems, about how loving someone inside those systems demands more than passion. It demands a reimagining of the rules. That's heavy stuff, and yet the show keeps it digestible by constantly anchoring these big ideas in small, intimate human moments. An old woman giving Udano a charm, for luck, even after discovering he's been lying about who he is. A child happily calling him Uncle Spendthrift, with no idea how layered that nickname really is. A moment where Rexardi, after finally recognizing the flaws in blindly following orders, chooses to disobey a direct command in order to protect unarmed civilians, and then sits alone afterward, shaking, because his entire identity has just cracked. All these beats accumulate into the emotional tapestry that makes the finale much more than just, who wins the girl. When the palace finally explodes into open conflict, when the Prime Minister's schemes collide with external enemies and internal dissent, the structure of the competition all but collapses, and we're left with something rawer, more frightening, a power vacuum and a people watching to see who steps into it. And this is where the show does something quietly radical. It refuses to let one man be the sole savior. Udano plays a crucial role, of course, but so do Aining, Rexardi, Sogura, the kitchen workers, the guards, the merchants, even the nameless soldiers. Scenes of big decisions are frequently intercut with scenes of ordinary people reacting, helping, resisting, and the message is clear. A kingdom is not changed by a single clever strategist or a single righteous princess. It is changed when enough people stop accepting the old stories about what is necessary. There's this chilling, beautiful moment near the climax where the palace gates, once symbols of unassailable authority, are physically held open by the people to let in food from the countryside after the corrupt grain hoarding is exposed. The visual metaphor is so on the nose it's almost blunt, but it works, because we've spent so much time with both the inner court and the outer world that seeing them literally connect, with the gates no longer acting as a barrier, genuinely lands as cathartic. In the aftermath of all this, we come back, inevitably, to Udano himself, standing in the ruins of the role he once played. Everyone now knows he is not the fool they thought. For some, that's cause for Admiration, for others, proof that he's too dangerous, too unpredictable. His spendthrift mask is shattered, but the question the show leaves hanging, and the one that makes it stick with you after it ends, is, what replaces it? Can a person who has lived so long in disguise ever fully relax into being known, or will there always be another layer of performance, another defense? The final scenes don't wrap that up with a bow. Instead, we see him repeatedly offered positions of formal power. General, minister, royal consort, and repeatedly hesitating. Each offer represents not just status but a potential new mask, a role with its own expectations and compromises. And as much as we, the audience, might want him to accept a title and claim a happy ending, the show respects the complexity of what that would mean. There's a quiet, devastating shot where he walks through the marketplace as himself. No exaggerated spending, no drunken behavior, and people don't quite know how to greet him. Some bow too deeply, others avoid eye contact, a few old friends still clap him on the shoulder like nothing has changed, but you can feel the distance now, the way truth has altered their relationship to him. He has stepped out of one story, but he hasn't fully stepped into another, and that's what makes Topeng Pemboros episode feel like a first chapter of something bigger. Even if the season itself is complete, it's less about a final victory and more about the painful birth of a new way of being, both for one man and for an entire kingdom. Narratively, that's a risky choice, because some viewers will always crave the clean triumph, the neatly tied up arcs, but thematically it's exactly right. Because stories about masks are really stories about process, about the slow, halting, sometimes reversed steps it takes to put down old armor. And watching Udano take those steps, stumbling but moving forward, is, in the end, what makes the whole journey so satisfyingly human. So if you found yourself weirdly emotional at scenes that, on paper, sound simple, a man sharing a bowl of porridge with a servant, a princess rolling up a map herself instead of letting an attendant do it, a former rival quietly stepping into formation at Udano's side during a tense standoff. That's not an accident, that's the show gently telling you that the real revolutions don't always look like battles, sometimes they look like people choosing to see each other fully, past the costumes and the scripts they've been handed. Topeng Pemboros episode invites us not just to enjoy that as fiction, but to wonder where in our own lives we might be laughing a little too loudly, spending a little too carelessly, or hiding a little too well. And that's why, when the credits roll and the music fades and the image of that rain-soaked grave dissolves into black, it doesn't feel like an ending at all. It feels like a question mark, aimed straight at the viewer. Now that you've seen what a mask can cost and what taking it off can change, what will you do with that knowledge? And if you're here, still listening, still turning that over, asking for more of this script, then I think the story has already done its work on you in some small way. You're carrying Udano, Aining, their courage and their fears, somewhere in the back of your mind, and maybe, just maybe, the next time you're tempted to play small to stay safe, or to judge someone based on the role they are visibly performing, you'll remember the boy who pretended to waste everything and ended up saving more than he ever expected. And if a show can do that, can entertain you, move you, and also tweak the way you look at your own world, even a little, then in my book, that's something special, something worth revisiting, rewatching, and yes, talking about in way too much detail on a channel like this. So as we draw this extended look to a close, as we leave the clatter of the market stalls, the echo of the training grounds, the hush of the palace corridors at midnight, and the unending whisper of that first night's rain, I'll turn the question back to you one more time, not as a gimmick but as an invitation to keep thinking, feeling, and maybe demanding more stories like this.